Okay, everyone. The goal of the module this week is to get some practice with rasters. We've been working with vector data pretty much since we started working in QGIS. But for me, rasters are more exciting because I actually work with rasters almost exclusively. I never do any work with vector data. Um, and if you'll recall, rasters are effectively images where the data are contained within the pixels. Each individual pixel represents some sort of data. It could be elevation, it could be something else. Quite often it's elevation, and in the case of the lab this week, that's what we're going to be working with. And then you can represent that in a variety of ways in a raster. So here, for example, is an image of Mount Hood. In the middle here, we just have a picture of it. And on the left, you have Mount Hood elevation represented in a raster through contour lines. So if you've seen topo maps before, you're familiar with this. Each line here represents one elevation. So if you follow the line, everywhere along that line is the same elevation. And then they're spaced evenly. So for example, perhaps every line represents an additional 200 meters of elevation as we go up. I don't know. I don't actually know what the spacing is on this one, but something. And they're very useful, right? So for example, if I wanted to climb Mount Hood, I would look for places where the elevation doesn't change too rapidly. So where the contour lines are nice and far apart. So that's a gentler slope to climb. I wouldn't necessarily want to climb up from here, right? The contour lines are spaced very close together, so I can tell that this is quite steep. On the right, we have a 3D model of Mount Hood, and this one's overlaid with a digital elevation model, or DEM, that's represented by color. So the green color represents lower elevations up into the yellow, and then the orange-red and higher elevations all the way up to this white. So this is visually very easy to tell what's going on, right? This is almost easier for our eyes to make sense of than the topo map, but might contain less concrete quantitative data than the lines do. So you represent data the way that makes sense for the purpose that you're trying to accomplish. Could be visual, could be more quantitative. Another really good use of rasters is to overlay them with vector data to enrich their purpose. So this, for example, is a 3D model. We can see elevation, we can see topography, but we've overlaid this with dark, thick red lines that are major roads, thinner gray lines that are minor roads, and then this partially transparent brown polygon, and this represents a mud flow zone. So which areas are at risk of mud flows from an eruption at Mount Hood. And then they've also put mud flow travel times on this as well. So the point here is that if we take raster data, we can enrich it by adding vector data. And in this case, we've created a hazard prediction map. But we can do it with all variety of different data. And the idea here is that rasters are often a base layer or a base map that we start with. Now we've already talked about this, so I don't want to drive the point home too much, but I'll just remind you that the primary difference between rasters and vectors, let's look up here at point features. So on the left, this is an example of vector point features. If I zoom in on one of these red X's, it would continue to be exactly the same size red X, and it would point to one specific location on Earth at effectively, infinite precision, because it's just going to go to that one single solitary point. Whereas in a raster, an individual point consists of one pixel, and that pixel has a finite size. For example, Landsat is a common satellite imagery source. We're not going to use it in this class, I don't think, but Landsat, I think, has 30 meter by 30 meter pixels. So as I zoom in, this pixel is still defined by being 30 meters by 30 meters. And eventually, if I zoom in far enough, this one pixel will take up my entire map area, and my resolution will go down. So your rasters have a finite resolution that depends on the size of the pixel. We can see the same thing here in line features. So for example, rivers or polygons, perhaps we're looking at, I don't know, continents or geomorphic areas, right? Maybe this is a certain type of sediment and this is another type. But polygons, we have precise edges in vector data, and in rasters, we can only work with the resolution of our pixels, the size of our pixels. So this is just to get you thinking, what is exactly a raster? Remember, rasters are photos. Each pixel contains data. So bottom left here, this is a satellite image in regular visible spectrum. So the colors that we see in the image are the colors that our eyes would see. So this contains data. This is a raster. It just tells us about the visible spectrum of light. So the data here is how much red, how much blue, how much green. But what about up here? This is just a photograph. Well, it's still a raster. It's still RGB. Each pixel tells us about how much light and what colors of light are in that particular part of the picture. It's just in this case we don't really have spatial data because I couldn't tell you the coordinate of this black tree pixel. But this is still a raster, and theoretically, perhaps in a way, we could try to geo-reference it to somewhere on Earth and have spatial data. So this is something I've already been talking about. Rasters are limited by the size of the pixel. So the more pixels you have, the smaller the pixels in an individual area. And the lower resolution, we have fewer pixels and they're larger in size. So this on the left is a high resolution image, and it's 300 dpi, which is dots per inch. So basically pixels per inch. So if you put 300 of them in a square inch, that's a lot of pixels that are small, and we get this nice sharp image quality. Whereas over here we only have 72 pixels in an inch. So 72 of them, much larger pixels, and we lose a lot of our clarity. So I think over here it would be hard to even make out what this image is. So it's not always that higher resolution is better and lower resolution is worse. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I can tell you from my own personal experience, sometimes higher resolution isn't any better. In fact, depending on what you're trying to do, you might have to take a high resolution image and decrease the resolution. I have to do that sometimes when I run computationally heavy analyses because there's simply too many pixels and the math balloons and it becomes impossible for your computer to do. So it just depends on your use case. So I want to talk a little bit more about resolution. We have different types of resolution. So for example, spatial resolution, that is the area that's covered by each pixel, or the pixel size. Yeah, okay. So the way this is worded is a little bit funky here. But what I want to explain with this is, so pretend that your pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters. Let's say that I was taking an image of just a big green grass field. And in the middle of that field, I had a 1 meter gray boulder. So what is my pixel going to be if I have a 30 meter by 30 meter resolution? I'm just going to get a green pixel. I will lose that boulder because the color of the boulder will average out within the pixel size. So it might technically change the green value a little bit on towards gray, for example. But overall, I'm going to lose the smaller features, and they're simply going to average out the color of that pixel. Same thing with elevation. So if I have a 30 meter pixel, what it is going to tell me is the average elevation in that 30 meters. So if I covered 100, well, that's a little bit excessive. Let's say my elevation increased 5 meters over the 30 meter pixel. It's just going to average that. This one is worth pointing out here. So at the end I say spatial resolution is determined by the length of one side of the square pixel. So I say square pixel. We hope it's a square pixel. Some data sources, depending on the projection that you're using and what you've done to it, you might actually have rectangular pixels. I get into trouble with that all the time. It becomes very inconvenient. So you can get pixels that are longer than they are wide. In this class, I think we're only ever going to work with square pixels, so we're not going to worry about it. But we talk about resolution as, I said 30 meter pixel before, so that means that one side of the pixel is 30 meters long. So the area of a pixel would be 30 times 30, or 900 square meters. So this is an example of going from vector data, where a polygon has effectively infinite resolution around the edge because we've defined it as such, to lower and lower raster resolution. So this would be a 5 meter raster. Notice where our polygon edge crosses through a pixel, If it's over 50% of the pixels within the polygon, then we highlight it. And so we have this bit of the pixel that's outside of the polygon that simply has to be there. So that's a limitation of the resolution, right? But this is still fairly sharp. Now, if we increase this to 10 meter resolution, we're worse off yet. Now we have really coarse boundaries. We've lost some shape. And then at 30 meter resolution, we're even worse. So depending on the features that you're looking at, depending on the work that you're trying to accomplish, you want to think about the resolution of your data source. Very important. This is an example of a digital elevation model in central Spain. And on the left, we have a 30 meter resolution digital elevation model. And on the right, we have a 5 meter resolution DEM. So the idea here is to look at just the difference in what you're able to make out in between the two. So here on the 30 meter resolution, I can see this large valley. I can see this ridge here. I can see this ridge, the ridge here at the top. I can see some smaller ridges leading down into the valley, stuff like that. But I can't make out a lot of fine structural detail. Meanwhile, over here in the 5 meter resolution, I can make out many more of these little ridges. I can make out even smaller bits of the topography leading off of those ridges. There's lots of analysis that I can do about the landscape shape that I couldn't in 30 meter resolution because I can see so much here. Especially on this side of the valley, you can see a lot more features that you couldn't in 30 meter resolution. So again, more information is contained when you have more pixels and better resolution. So more information is more better. This here is a 50 centimeter versus 50 meter DEM of Denali. Let me see if I can get that open. Okay, perfect. So this is a shaded relief of that DEM. So this is the original USGS DEM. That's 50 meter resolution. You really can't make much out. We can see that we have the shape of the peak. We can see some kind of undulations in the surface, but not a whole lot. And then here's our 50 centimeter DEM. So we can make out quite a bit more detail here. We can make out a lot of features. We can make out cracks in snow, glacial features. One thing worth pointing out is that we have introduced, by increasing our resolution so much, we've introduced artifacts. So you see here, this is part of a resolution change that, or an elevation change that our resolution couldn't really resolve properly. So we end up with this, what we call an artifact. This happens all the time, and it's something to keep your eyes out for. I think that's really the only place, the only thing that I wanted to demonstrate here. So just remember, the finer the resolution, the more data contained within your image. Like I mentioned before, you don't have to have square pixels, but generally speaking, rasters are, and that makes them a grid. So we have a grid of pixels, we have a value that's assigned to it, and it's usually an integer or what we call floating point value. So float just means decimals. And if you're ever unsure of exactly how your data is formatted within your raster, you can always check your attribute table in QGIS and figure it out. And sometimes rasters can contain multiple bands or multiple data products within it. So you could change which value you want your raster to show. All right. So this is an example of an attribute table of a raster. You always have to have some sort of a value within each pixel. The value can absolutely be 0, but it doesn't have to be. So here's an example. Each pixel here is given a value for red, green, and blue. So 0, 0, 0, this is a black pixel. And if we had a 1, 1, 1, that would be a white pixel. And then everything else is a variety of mixing red, green, and blue to be something. So if you had a visible spectrum image, just like a regular satellite image, this would tell you about what is visible. So green would, I don't know, maybe plants and brown is maybe dirt. But you can also have infrared and near infrared and UV and all sorts of different colors that represent data differently, depending on what wavelength and what spectrum you're in. This is not incredibly important, I don't think. I'm just trying to point out here that each pixel has an index, so that each pixel is unique. We know which pixel is which, for example, and then we attribute data to it. So this was visible spectrum, but here, for example, we might have each pixel has a value that stands for meters above sea level, so that's a DEM. And then you can also have qualitative. So you could have a raster where each color corresponds to a type of land. So blue here would be water. Red here is looks like a road to me, so maybe human infrastructure. And white is maybe grassland or something, agriculture. I'm not sure what this picture is, other than a lake. But you can have qualitative rasters. That's what I'm trying to point out here. And then this we already talked about, but here's a road. Here's how I would represent it in a vector. It's just a line. And in raster data, you have to select each pixel, which corresponds to that feature. So notice we don't have sharp edges like we do in the vector data set. We have pixels corresponding to where that road exists. This is a rather low resolution one, right? Because our road doesn't really look like this. It looks thicker here than it ought to be. Actually, this is a good thing to point out. In a raster data set, I've already mentioned this, but just to remember, you can't have anything smaller than the size of a single pixel. So this road here, it goes pretty straight, so it's not multiple pixels, but it can't be any smaller than 1. You can't fill in half of a pixel. So each pixel here represents the road. So why do we like rasters? Raster data is collected all the time, constantly, by hundreds upon hundreds of satellites that do different things. I don't know why it says cheap here. That's not really fair. Collecting raster data can be extremely expensive. These satellites are very expensive missions to send up. But easy to collect is fair. You send up something with a camera, whether it's a regular camera or a camera that has measures different wavelengths for different purposes. Maybe you send up a radar, like SAR, if you're familiar with that can pierce through clouds. But all you do is you just keep taking snapshots, right, of different regions. So every day, satellites across the world are sending petabytes upon petabytes of data back to data servers that much of it you can download, which makes it freely available. So there's tons of raster data out there in the world, just tons of it. That is not to say that rasters are perfect sources of data. They're often very difficult to work with. And one of the reasons for that is that rasters they can be extremely large. So especially as you have high resolution rasters, you can get individual files becoming, many gigabytes. So especially I do a lot of drone surveying, for example. My pixels are 2 centimeters. And so if I take a survey of hundreds of meters of an area, I now have millions and millions and millions of pixels. So if I want to do something to that raster in QGIS, that calculation has to be run on each pixel. So now you're doing millions of calculations. So large files, they can be very difficult computationally to work with. You need sometimes a lot of computer power to be able to do things with them. They're not sharp, we know that. So you're limited by the size of your pixels, unlike vectors. And the more you zoom into a raster, the worse it's going to get. The more you zoom in, the larger an individual pixel is going to be on your screen, and you lose sharpness, you lose clarity. And then finally here, when we do transformations on rasters, which we try to avoid doing as much as we can, it's going to change the shape of it. So we already know about map projections. If you try to reproject a raster, you're going to stretch it around. And that can be very tricky. So one thing that I like to do, and this might be something that you have to think about with your final projects, is that as you're working with raster data, it can be very helpful if you have a large raster to let that determine the CRS of your project. So that way you don't reproject your raster, you reproject the vectors or whatever else to the CRS, to the CRS of your raster. So something to think about. So if you take home anything from this, just remember that rasters and vectors are very different. They store data very differently, and that rasters are always fundamentally limited by the resolution, by the size of the pixel. Remember that each pixel contains a value, and that value is your data. And that's basically it. The rasters that we're going to work with this week in class are digital elevation models, and so the data contained in each pixel is going to be elevation above sea level, height above sea level. Okay, so that's it. Go ahead and watch the tutorial videos next to go through your lab, and good luck with working with rasters.